Hello, nerds! My guest today is Jonathan Herzog, and he was one of Andrew Yang's first 10 members of his presidential campaign. In fact, Yang tapped Herzog to move to Iowa to launch the Yang strategy in that state. Now, obviously, Yang ended up dropping out, but in this interview with Jonathan Herzog, we talk about how Yang built his early strategy. How did the Yang gang get so strong on Twitter to the point where they could make their own hashtags trend? And other insights to the early stage of that campaign. More importantly, we jump into Herzog's journey back to New York, where he threw his own hat in the race. Last year, August 2019, he said, "I am running for the congressional seat, the 10th congressional seat here in New York," which makes up a lot of the West Side and other parts of the area. But he's not going to have an easy run at it. He's running against 15-term congressional powerhouse Jerry Nadler. Took the seat there in 92, which I believe was 2 years before Jonathan was born. If Jonathan gets the seat, he'd be the youngest ever at just 25 years old. He's hoping to run and get elected on things like a freedom dividend, $1,000 a month to every American, a data bill of rights to, keep consumers and have us keep control of our data, and maybe tamper down some of the centralization of wealth associated with these multi-billionaires that run these corporations that use our data. Also, we jump into what blockchain could look like in the future, but none of this is going to be easy. His precinct has 720,000 total potential voters. A very few amount will actually vote. He needs 30,000 votes to win on the primary in June 23rd, but it's not going to be easy. He's fighting nasty lawsuits, a lot of courts, media disinformation campaigns, and more. So the question is, can Jonathan Herzog get 30,000 votes and win, taking down powerhouse Jerry Nadler? Well, let's hear from the man himself, Jonathan Herzog.
So Jonathan, Iowa, for a guy that's at Harvard, they seem like two worlds apart. Did you spend meaningful time in Iowa prior to moving there for Yang?
So the answer was a no. The first time I had set foot was with Yang, just a couple of weeks prior. But the reality was, to your point about you and your work and your audience of entrepreneurs and builders, is it's really like we actually called it from the inside. We put together this Instagram, just like kind of the early employees, called Startup Politics, because that's exactly what it was. We were wearing 50 different hats, doing 50 different functions, doing the job of 50 different people, essentially. And so everyone, to your previous question, came from all walks of life with no political background, just because the urgency and the strength of the vision and the need in that moment was so strong.
So paint that picture for me again. You show up in Iowa. Are you also, besides your own precinct, trying to recruit other precinct leaders? What'd you guys end up with penetration-wise? Did you have a precinct leader for all 1,600 precincts?
So this goes back to, again, the fall of 2018. Now at this point, Nathan, basically, I think we were one of maybe a handful of people who had declared in a field that ended up growing to 29, the largest field in, I think, Democratic presidential history. So people you think of like Kamala Harris, Kirsten et al. Had not even declared at that point. Mm-hmm. So I remember, it was Yang, myself, and another team member, and we were at the Progress Iowa event in December of 2018. It was Andrew Yang, Pete Buttigieg, who had not formally declared, because everyone sort of declares an exploratory committee, or they share some public speech indicating their interest. Pete Buttigieg, Jeff Merkley, and maybe one other at that event. And right after, we got our first 1% in a national CNN poll. And I remember driving back in the car with Andrew. And again, this was the scrappiest campaign by any measure, but he's just elated after this 1% at the end of December 2018, because he says, we have found product market fit. We spent a year and a half sort of building the foundation, getting this really businessman and entrepreneur from anonymity. And Rogan was on the calendar for early of 2019. And it was really at that moment where we said we found product market fit. And so Muhan has kind of laid out these 5 distinct phases of the campaign, mapping out the almost 3 years of its progression. But at that point, there were no such thing as precinct captains. There were no such thing as even other team members in Iowa.
Interesting.
The day in the life essentially looked, on average, I would get up let's say 5 a.m., drive 3 hours to a local union hall, church, school, Democratic club meeting. There might be 8 to 10 candidates, again, depending, if it's, let's say, early
at the same meeting.
Yeah. So you basically have these like cattle calls. So Amy Klobuchar would speak, Pete Buttigieg would speak, Eric Swalwell. Again, there were literally 26 like different campaigns at that point. And then I would get up and speak, make the Yang pitch, get people to sign up, hand out swag, answer questions, speak to some of the press, and then pack up shop, drive 3 hours, do the same thing in a different city halfway across the state. And that's what building person to person, county to county, event by event looked like in the early days.
So why did Buttigieg, I think Yang finished 6th in Iowa, 8,900 votes, but Buttigieg just did so well in Iowa. What did you must have come to these your point about these cattle calls, you must have come across his people as you were doing this. What were they doing differently than everyone else that allowed him to finish so strongly in Iowa?
Yeah, so there are a lot of factors in terms of the nitty gritty of the caucus process. So having been a precinct captain myself, what you saw was on the first alignment, so there's 2 alignments in the process, right? People kind of gather and they self-organize into different clusters in the room, declaring who their favorite candidate is. And then they have a certain 15% viability threshold to allocate the delegates, the winnings of the state. Now, after people lock into who their first candidate is, people have the choice and a chance to realign, to say, well, my candidate wasn't viable. Let's say you supported Tom Steyer. In our case, he wasn't viable. So then
God bless him.
So his handful of folks get to decide where they go to realign. So you have the final count after the second round. And what you saw is Pete Buttigieg had the most significant gains. He was more people's second choice than almost anyone. And so he may not have had, the vast majority on the first round, but there were many, many people who said, I'm happy enough with Pete. And so realigned to him in the second round, which was the final count. But again, these are the sort of nitty gritty of the politics of the night of a caucus. And really the kind of sausage is made in the weeks and months leading up to that, with the press and with the debates and endorsements and so on.
Did he do something in the weeks and months leading up to that to make sure was that the strategy to be the best second choice once all these other people filtered out that didn't meet the threshold?
So again, ultimately, this didn't bear out in a win in the primary process. And so we're kind of seeing a whole reevaluation of the Iowa caucus as this decisive factor. It really came into our consciousness because of Jimmy Carter sort of coming out of nowhere and being bolstered by it, and also with Barack Obama and being able to prove to voters in later states in the process, particularly voters of color, that you can bring the Iowa voters around you. So, in this case, it ended up being that neither the winner of the Iowa caucus, nor the New Hampshire primary, nor the Nevada caucus ended up becoming the presumptive nominee. And it just shows you how hard it is to extrapolate from any of these events because we're running against Donald Trump. And so there are a lot of other factors at play. But certainly Pete had an incredible ground game in Iowa that led many, many people to be comfortable with him as their second choice or what have you.
Math, make America think again. And hello, nerds and Yang Gang and Blue Hat. One one thing you have to have in today's political world is a very strong online organic game. You see some people would argue potential candidates, it's bot driven. Others, you can tell it's truly organic. I want to know what you guys, because this is relevant to someone building a business or to someone running for candidacy. How did you guys build the infrastructure to basically allow anything Yang wanted to trend on Twitter to trend almost instantly?
Well, so what's incredible, Nathan, is that, again, our candidate literally started fundraising from his Gmail address book. This is a guy who, first generation American, son of immigrants, had started out his career in entrepreneurship. His businesses had flopped. until one took off. And then the lion's share of his career was building Venture for America to help promote entrepreneurship in cities that needed a boost after the financial crisis. And so we didn't really have a whole network of connections and donors and capital and relationships to work off of. So really the innovation was born out of the necessity, where many of the people who were drawn to Yang and to the campaign came to it from, again, these long form, substantive 1, 2, 3 hour podcasts where we would dive into the data and the fact that American life expectancy had declined for 3 years consecutively before Trump, before COVID. The data that we saw this great divergence between GDP and the increase in the stock market and the returns to labor or even life expectancy itself. And so we had this really high need for cognition audience that then, to your point about having a brand identity around it, so much of being Yang and being math and data friendly is kind of wrapped into people's identity and just essence of their being. So following the Joe Rogan podcast, that was kind of our big reveal and the big moment in early 2019. And in order to qualify for the first Democratic debate, which was always the kind of first order goal in the early stages, we had to secure 65,000 individual contributions from American adults. And so we have these very objective metrics established by the DNC for polling and for fundraising. And so it was really a matter of how do we reverse engineer? We know we have these really specific, explicit outputs, and we know what our product is. In this case, it's Yang himself and the ideas and the vision of the campaign. And then we just had to wrap that into an identity and a shared sense of community, because it just organically what it became, particularly given that all of the gatekeepers and sense-making institutions were not necessarily, including us in their messaging.
So there's a lot of candidates with great messages, right? But they never build the kind of online sort of Yang gang, super aggressive, super into it. They pay a lot of attention following like Yang did. From what I'm hearing you say, you're crediting most of that to the message. These are math nerds. They're science. They look at facts. It's part of their identity. I just think you're skimming over, like, there's got to be tactics you guys did to actually activate that crew. So you would say something like, Yang is going to tweet this at 8 a.m. on Thursday. Make sure you all retweet it fairly quickly. These 10 people are power tweeters in Iowa. I mean, did you have that kind of infrastructure to push these messages forward in the form of hashtags on Twitter?
So certainly as the campaign evolved, there was this kind of distributed, decentralized snowflake model where you had particular like nodes in the network. And it actually is interesting, to your point. People have done some like graphical analysis of like where tweets come from the different candidates. And what you'll see is, even, for example, in the Bernie Sanders movement, there was a pretty centralized node from which the kind of messages and the retweets emanated from.
Who? What was it?
Oh, I mean, like the Bernie Sanders account, or the like designated surrogates of the Bernie Sanders
So
account.
It is the candidate usually, or the surrogates.
Exactly. And then in our case, what was different, and this is actually more paralleling the Trump campaign's kind of digital approach, which was, it was highly, highly decentralized. And so you had lots and lots and lots of independent nodes and this independent sort of media network of people organically saying like, let Yang speak, or these hashtags that like ended up trending even when he wasn't on the debate stage ended up coming up organically from these decentralized nodes. But over time, as the months and years passed, there was more coordination around them. But that was one of the critical differences, is that the message wasn't being controlled from the top down. It was happening in many, 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 many different places across the country.
There's a lot of people that say ideas don't become something that gets, mainstream without an opposite, right? Kind of like laws of energy, right? Nothing's destroyed, but you need opposites. How critical is it in a political campaign to make sure there is a clear enemy to use to activate your following, even to the extent that if you feel like you don't have an enemy, you have to make one?
So this is also a very perceptive question. And I studied psychology, and certainly
this is why I was gonna say this is why I invited you on, by the way, because I saw the background and I'm like, he was in it. He was picking up some of these psychological things along the way. So teach us.
No, I mean, you got it, which is the human mind is a narrative seeking thing, entity, creature, beast. And so you see Trump and the 2016 race define these lines very clearly, where there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of suffering by the data and anecdotally across the country, right? And in our telling of the case, we automated millions of manufacturing jobs, in particular in swing states across the country, and those districts ended up swinging from Obama to Trump. And that was the theory of the case, that automation and the fourth industrial revolution was what was driving this sense of malaise and frustration. Now, if you look at the 2016 campaign, what were the two dominant messages? Make America great again, and essentially, America is already great. The thing is, the deaths of despair, the fact that suicides and drug overdoses from opiates had overtaken vehicle deaths as leading causes of death, and the Ponzi scheme level of inequality, these are all true. And so centering a campaign, a national presidential campaign around America's already great. And if you look at the data where the Clinton campaign won, we're disproportionately in cities that were winning from the sort of globalization neoliberal consensus. And so in terms of, well, who can the human mind then blame or scapegoat? If it's not the Chinese, if it's not the Mexicans, if it's not the Jews, in our case, it was the robots. And I love this because A, I think it's empirically accurate. B, it feeds into our mind's need to find an easy, simple answer for the confusion and, again, the pain and suffering that runs deep and is real. But that target is not human. It is systemic, it's structural, and it is in the Amazon warehouses, right?
But Jonathan, I was going to say, isn't it better with your psychology background? Isn't it better in a political campaign to have it has to be a person, a being? The Chinese government is fine, but like Nancy Pelosi is better, right? Like the media is fine, but Jim Acosta in the front row at the press conference is a better enemy, even if it only spans the week-long news cycle. Don't you need people enemies to have a political successful campaign? It's
certainly a lot more potent, right? It's a lot more potent when you can rile up your base and call together all this energy, right, and vitriol towards a person or a group of people, particularly a group that has been historically the brunt of that narrative.
Isn't that a sad thing, by the way? I mean, it's a sad question. In my opinion, it's a sad question that I have to ask. But you look at like when you study successful campaigns, be it political or anything else, there have to be two sides. There has to, in an NFL game, there has to be the Redskins and the Cowboys. Like there have to be two competing. That's the narrative.
I hear you. I think to me, what was so empowering, and yes, we did not win the White House, right? We did not win the presidency this time. But what I will say is, the idea of running a humanity first campaign. I mean, Andrew was, again, if you look at the data on this, it's shocking. The only candidate who never attacked, never any ad hominems, never any personal attack against any of his competitors, or even Trump or anyone who had voted for Trump. In fact, one of the things he said to the tens of thousands of former Trump voters who came over to support his campaign, many people I know, very closely, he said, "You count twice. Like, we're not here to vilify you. That doesn't get us anywhere. We're here to offer a vision that you can see yourself in as well." And I hear you. It is very hard to do because all of the incentives and forces from whether you're a politician, whether you're a media institution, or whether you're even a political party, don't necessarily align with lowering the tensions, with not offering that scapegoat, because there's a lot of incentives in place that are predicated upon that scapegoat. It's challenging. Historically, it's challenging, where if you look at structural change and what has enabled it, you're right. It has been war, Great Depression, great calamity, like the Great Depression in the last century. But part of our project, part of what we have to constantly work towards, because there's no inevitability, there's no natural order to history, there's no teleology, is to decouple crisis from structural change. We're entering the next Great Depression per the Fed. COVID has now killed more Americans than died in the Vietnam War. The CDC says a 9/11 death toll will begin every single day starting June 1st.
But Jonathan, this is the crisis that could usher in UBI. Like, that's a thing.
Yes. And Congress has been on recess. That's the kicker, is that, I'm running and I'm here. I'm based in the city, in the district, in the state, in the country that has been the worst offender. No contact tracing, no testing, highest case fatality rate and infection rate in the world. And the former CDC director said that if New York City had shut down just 10 days sooner, 50 to 80% of all COVID-related deaths could have been avoided. So the level of institutional failure, collapse, incompetence, and corruption is at a scale we've really hardly imagined and fathomed.
But Jonathan, so to your point you just made about a minute and a half ago, how do you decouple regulatory change and crisis? When people are in a state of status quo that they feel is good enough, there's no incentive to do anything. When the headline is 3,000 new people dead every day and 9/11 every day, regulators are very incentivized to do something right now because they look very bad if they didn't their constituents. How do you decouple a crisis with real regulatory change?
Yes. So this is what we've been doing, what we've been going through the past week in particular, and I'll highlight a couple of instances. It involves holding people's feet to the fire, holding them accountable, and offering an incentive and a vision that, again, doesn't vilify them, offers them a way in, but holds their feet to the fire. Now, very concretely, you may have seen Andrew Yang, myself, and dozens of other delegates filed suit because the New York State Board of Elections, the New York State Democratic Party, and all of its leadership decided to cancel the presidential primary. Now, this was 1 week after our presumptive nominee, Joe Biden, warned that we have to be very wary that President Trump may use COVID as false pretense to postpone the general election.
By the way, for my audience that doesn't follow politics, why'd they do it? Why'd they do it?
Yes. So again, a fantastic question. Now, they have many reasons. They want to allegedly save the resources. They want to just hand the nomination to whoever they would like to without having a primary. And I'll walk through these reasons in just a moment, but we had Michael Sandel on our dialectic about a week ago. And without even having context about this lawsuit and this decision, he's, by all accounts, our country's greatest moral philosopher. He said, the most dangerous precedent that can be set is anything that enables the president, our president, to postpone or cancel the election. And the New York State Democratic Party, the Board of Election Commissioners, did just that. I'm not a mind reader, so to your question, I don't know what reasons they had. I do know they just lost in federal court in the Southern District of New York, and the judge said, this is false pretense. The governor of New York had already passed an executive order making voting safe by mail. So any narrative or story otherwise that this would put anyone at risk is just bullshit.
People listening, Jonathan, right now are going to go, so you have people saying Trump's going to try and, get around this next election by essentially using the virus to his advantage. And then you have the people he's going to compete against in New York say, you know what, let's hold my beer. We're going to cancel it. There has to be a reason they did it. You've got to be in touch with what their reasoning is. Otherwise, there's no way to figure out how to counter it. What was the reason?
So I'll give you another piece of evidence that may just inform this very
Come on, Jonathan. What is it?
Okay, here it goes. This past Wednesday, Nathan, we launched our first Facebook ad, our first digital ad, which has gone in front of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of registered Democrats in New York's 10th district, where I'm running, the west side of Manhattan and South Brooklyn. We're running to unseat Congressman Nadler, who's held the seat for almost 30 years. Immediately thereafter, a targeted, systematic disinformation campaign was launched, where if you Google my name, Jonathan Herzog, on a computer and hit the news tab, you will see hundreds, thousands of false headlines, improperly indexed through SEO manipulation to myself, Andrew Yang, and Jeff Curzon. These headlines are disproportionately related to murder, suicide, death, Russia, COVID, bodily harm, and Trump. And they're all run by local news affiliates owned by Sinclair Broadcast Group, which if you don't have any contacts on Google, learn more about them. They own 76% of all local news affiliates in the United States, and they're widely considered a Trump-affiliated propaganda arm.
Not wildly, by the way. One of the largest donors. Many of you guys saw during the presidential campaign, there was a viral clip that went viral where they basically took hundreds of local media stations and you saw all these different anchors in one shot saying the same thing. What made that possible was connections that Trump had to Sinclair Broadcasting Group, which basically could push all these messages out and make them look localized. My question to you, Jonathan, on this though, why would Sinclair Broadcast Group support Nadler? Why would they help Nadler by suppressing your digital campaign? That doesn't make any sense.
Nathan, you, the FBI, the Office of the Inspector General, the New York Attorney General, the country's best election, internet, and privacy lawyers, and citizens and activists everywhere are asking the same question.
What's your best answer?
I don't know. All I know is that this is under investigation for a federal crime and for federal election fraud. We have a primary in 40 days. The race, in this particular race, over $2 million has been spent. The field has narrowed from 8 to 3. And I have become, at least in the past week, the singular threat and challenge to the to Representative Nadler's seat. And this lawsuit that we won this past week to reinstate the primary, to just give people the chance to vote, is now being appealed in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And if you look at the brief, if you look at the filing, you have the New York Attorney General arguing to cancel the primary, the New York Governor arguing to cancel the primary, the New York State Democratic Party, and this entire cast of characters. I don't know why.
I mean, Jonathan, it could just be they are worried about a second wave, right? Without contact tracing, without testing, they're worried about a second wave. I mean, that is a legitimate thing they could be worried about. They don't want people walking into booths, even with mail-in,
no one's walking into booths, though, Nathan. The governor passed an executive action on his own doing weeks before, making voting safe by mail for everyone. If you're a resident of New York, no matter where you are, you can go to nycabsentee.com/absentee. It takes literally 1 minute and you can get your ballot mailed anywhere you are.
Mm-hmm.
And the other reality is congressional and state elections are happening regardless on June 23rd. So that's why the federal judge this past Monday said their argument was bullshit because people are anyways voting. They're voting for congressional elections like mine, for state assembly elections on the same day.
Mm-hmm. I just think there has to be some logic to all this, right? So like if I am, first off, let's just take a step back for a second because we never give context to this. Where are you running? And when did you launch your campaign?
Absolutely. I am a Democrat running for Congress in New York's 10th district, which covers the entire west side of Manhattan and South Brooklyn. And so this covers Wall Street, all the investment management.
There's some gerrymandering for you. A little chunk over here, a little chunk over there, clear across the waterway.
Just to hit, just to skip over
the subway,
over the East River. And And this is in many ways the ground zero for all the forces that we've been talking about in the Yang campaign and in the Yang gang, where, again, this is one of the most educated, most liberal urban districts, one of the biggest winners on the whole from this new economy. But 1 in 6 people live in poverty, can't meet their basic needs. And if you've ever set foot on the west side of Manhattan, you know, on one side of the street, you have public housing and squalor. And on the other side, you have a luxury housing development, often sitting just vacant as a foreign investment vehicle. So this is ground zero for the winner-take-all economy, the network effects, and the effects of automation that are defining this era.
We'll jump back, Jonathan. Let me jump back to that in a second. We'll talk about automation. We'll talk about the plans you laid on your website. But I want to inspire other people, young people listening, to do what you're doing. And I think a big part of that is demystifying the process.
Totally.
You announced in August 2019. What's the next step you had to do in your particular race? Everyone has different state and local laws, but what was the next step you had to do after you announced in 2019 to make sure you could move forward?
Totally. And I so appreciate it because this is exactly part of the goal. It's not about one person or anyone in particular. It's about having a wave of freedom Democrats, a wave of people committed to rebuilding, revitalizing, having a culture of entrepreneurship. You know, our generation is starting new businesses at the lowest rates over the past nearly half century. So here's the step by step of what you got to do. So in Andrew's case, you know, he was running for president.
Well, do yours, because the young people listening, they're going to be more likely to start at a local level like you are. They're going to want to walk in your footsteps.
Gotcha. Cool. So I went down the list and I Googled, what are the things you have to do or have to be to run for Congress? So you have to be 25 by the day you're inaugurated. I'm turning 25 on May 25th, which is a half a year or so before inauguration. Check. You have to have been a U.S. citizen or resident of the state for at least, I think, about 7 years. I'm a born and raised American, born and raised my entire life in the district. Check. Great. And then there's one other, depending on where you're running, I'm running in New York. You have to be an actual resident in that particular district by the inauguration. Again, check. Great. Then the process goes, I literally Google how do you file to run for Congress? So there's FEC Form 1, there's FEC Form 2. And now there's some forks in the road because there's some more problem solving. So you have to have a campaign checking account. You have to be able to collect money somehow. So then you're like, where do I go open a bank account? It turns out in New York, there's a bank called Amalgamated Bank, which is a non-for-profit and will open you a checking account very easily. But I did not know this. And so I went from Citibank to Bank of America to so on and so forth, got stonewalled and gaslit and so on and so forth.
Why? They don't want to open an account for you for a political campaign?
Not for a challenger to a Democratic incumbent.
Really?
Yes. And so, yes. And so if you're running in a primary against a very powerful incumbent, you will find that anyone you want to get any services from, whether that be accounting or legal or banking, you will have a very hard time doing that because of what's called the DCCC blacklist. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee decided recently, after 2018, where we saw a couple of people kind of fall through the cracks.
You're talking 14th district, AOC, 300K raise. She gets it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Where she had raised less than 1/10 of her opponent, Crowley. He raised $3 million. He was slated to be the next Speaker of the House. Her campaign was floundering until the end of May when they released this viral video, after which they gained most of their donations. There's the same dynamics where it's a highly liberal district, which has never faced a challenge in decades. And she won by a margin of 4,000 votes in her June primary in 2018, because no one votes in New York congressional primary.
How many, your district, I think, is 720 and 720,000 in terms of the 2010 census, so maybe bigger now. How many of those people actually vote in the primary?
30,000, so 4%, less than 4%. Yeah.
So how many votes do you need, in your opinion, when you model and reverse engineer? How many votes do you need to win?
In order to win the seat and unseat Jerry Nadler, we need 15,000 votes by mail by June 23rd.
Okay. Interesting. So I'm going to get into more of your policies in a second because there's a lot more to talk about, but let's keep this really tight here for a second. August 2019, you announced, you go through all these things, you get the bank account, you need signatures. How many signatures do you need?
Yes. So every single different type of campaign, and this may be more to New York because the laws and rules here are particularly onerous, particularly corrupt, just frankly. And so for our congressional campaign, so we got Yang on the ballot from the end of December to the end of January. And the window for our congressional campaign was February 25th and supposed to end April 2nd. Note, COVID came online exactly at this moment. Mm-hmm. So we needed by law, before the rules were changed, 1,250 signatures from registered Democrats on the west side of Manhattan and South Brooklyn to get on the ballot. Because of the way the systems work, everyone knows, or if you watch I think it's Bring Down the House, that documentary on Netflix, about the AOC win.
Yeah, you need way more than that because
exactly.
You'll get challenged like heck.
Exactly. So you have to bring in at least like 4x or 5x that.
Is that the margin? Is that the margin everyone's modeling now? Is you should, because of the incumbents that will challenge you and throw every legal challenge at every signature, and is it a legitimate signature? Either margin for error is now 4x whatever the requirement is.
Yes.
Wow. So how many did you get?
Yes. Well, so here's the thing. So our target, and we were exactly on pace to hit 5,000, exactly 4x by the end of the period. But COVID comes online, at least on public record, about 5 days after signature gathering starts. Now, we call for an end to the signature process because the actual process goes as follows. You come into personal, physical contact with 20,000 New Yorkers, because there's some ratio of like you're making a sale of your software or anything you're selling, there's going to be some ratio of just like no's, of fuck yous, and what have you. So we're coming into close personal contact with tens of thousands of New Yorkers. They have to manually, in person, sign using your pen, witnessed by you, in close proximity. We say, well, this is putting public health at risk. After, again, we had already collected about 1,500 at that point. Of course, nothing happens. We get our gloves, we get our alcohol swabs, we put our coats on, get back out there. They end up, even though the New York City Health Commissioner and the mayor and the governor alike said, all is good, business as usual, ride the subway, ride the bus, masks don't work. This goes on for about 2 weeks until literally thousands are now dying. Nadler, Cuomo, and the like get together, decide we're going to terminate the process early. And they change the requirement to only about 25% of the original, or 30%. So you only need 375 signatures.
And you already had 1,500.
We had over 3,000.
Okay, and this was as of what? Like this was as of like February.
So this is like mid-March. So like March 12th, 13th, 14th, like this. Okay. Now, I mean, I'm not sure if the kind of details of this are that interesting to you, but just to kind of illustrate, I'll share one story, one part of this.
I guess my question, did you get on the ballot?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
So we are 100% on the ballot. But here's the kicker. We were going to have essentially a one-on-one, face-to-face challenge with just us on the ballot and Jerry, because of this whole challenge process, right? Where you go line by line. And
how many now with way less signatures required?
Well, so we were going to have so we got someone, so the field has gone from 8 to 3, including us and Nadler. It was going to just be us and Nadler. But we were told, if you file an invalidating petition to get the other challenger off the ballot, who has a fairly low ceiling in the district, this will be an up to 6 weeks in-person process with members of your team, members of their team, members of the Board of Elections. By that point, 2 judges had already died. 1 was in a coma. Members of the Board of Election staff had died as well. And we were told, do you really want to be responsible for the possible death of a Board of Elections worker? So
who is the third, by the way, Jonathan? Who is the third? The spoiler.
Yeah, so there's Jerry Nadler, myself, and Lindsey Boylan, who are on the ballot in the 10th district. The only, so this is, again, just the context. Just the
How many signatures did she get?
So we actually found about an 80% invalidity rate going line by line because most of them were collected in the Bronx or Queens. Again, we're kind of getting in the weeds here. But
well, no, I'm curious because this is, if I'm Nadler, I find someone like this on purpose to split the vote that might go to you two. I mean, this is basically, I mean, you could predict this though. You're a smart guy. You're Harvard, number one. You know this is going to happen.
Well, so here's the thing, Nathan. So there actually was someone exactly like that who basically started collecting about 80% of their total 400 signatures in that weekend after the announcement was made and the deadline to file was. And so we easily got that candidate off the ballot because they had only a tiny fraction of the valid signatures. However, this other candidate, because they submitted, about 2,500 or so, it kind of would have taken this more onerous, invalidating process with members of the teams sitting across this table in person. And so what you described did actually happen. And yeah, I mean, again, it just goes to show you how at every single part of the process, and Nancy Pelosi said this herself, power is never given. It is always taken. And this bears out in every single way you could imagine.
So take it. Go find an old guy that's 70 that's going to split Nadler's vote, help him get signatures. I mean, why didn't you do that? I mean, because this is going to keep happening. There'll be other moments like this. Are you preparing for those things, even if it requires you have to do some of these things to win? So
we are heading back to court, back to the Second Circuit this Friday to defend our win to restore the presidential primary. And if they lose again and appeal again, it will go to the Supreme Court. And so absolutely, no one's taking this sitting down because, again, it's not even about this particular instance. The stakes are very, very high because the principle of the democratic process and constitutional freedoms are not something we can take for granted. We have to be constantly vigilant, especially amidst the crisis, especially when our president has already said it. He's looking for an excuse.
Jonathan, isn't Nadler on your side though? I mean, we just saw him beating the hell or doing his best. I don't think he's that tough, quite frankly. And he's, maybe a little slow, but we saw him trying to beat the heck out of the president in the impeachment trials. I mean, isn't he on your side?
I would, frankly, and we've said this all a lot, we're all on the same team. We're on team civilization. We're on team humanity. And anyone from any walk of life, any ideology or partisan background who wants to be on that team is welcome with open arms.
But you're running against, okay, so listen, whoever has a D next to their name, okay, on November 3rd is going to win your precinct. Correct. Jerry Nadler took that, I think, as 172,000 votes in 2016. Okay, so the real competition here is on June 23rd between you, Nadler, and maybe this third potential party. What I'm trying to figure out is you have to, in order to decide to, obviously you live in the 10th, so that's where you have to run, but you must also differentiate yourself from Nadler besides just saying he's old, I'm young, right?
Right. So at every opportunity, Nathan, and from the first week of the campaign, we were on the number one Fox, cable news TV show, and every interview thereafter with every major publication, we've maintained humanity first because.
Is Nadler inhumane?
It's not about Nadler at all. It's actually kind of totally orthogonal, independent from him. The fact is, COVID has killed more Americans than died in the Vietnam War. A 9/11 death toll every single day, and Congress has been on recess. It's not about him. It's not about me. It's about the fact that 20,000 New Yorkers have died. 30 million Americans are unemployed. We've entered the next Great Depression, and our federal government is asleep at the switch. So we're fighting for a universal basic income and dozens of other policy solutions because we're falling apart. And tragically, and this is what Andrew Yang said and what led him to decide to run in the first place, this random entrepreneur, right? No one is in the wings. No one is in the wings. to come save us. There are no adults in the room. And we have to save ourselves and offer a new alternative and a new way forward, because tragically, no one is in the wings.
So, I mean, what the sale you're giving me, by the way, is, from what I can hear, is the system is broken. I won't say bad things about now. The system is broken. People are dying. Congress isn't doing their job. They're not even there. You know, all this stuff. There's no one in the wings. So I just don't understand how that is a mobilizing message for a lot of people, especially Nadler voters who voted for him previously, to switch over to you. I mean, don't you have to have concrete policies that are different between you and him to win?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, he's one of the representatives who has not and will not sign on to direct cash transfers to Americans.
Why is that?
That's a great question.
What's he say?
He has no response. This is why I run. I did not set out to run for Congress. If you follow me on Instagram, you can see as such. I reached out to our leading politicians, academics, journalists, civil rights leaders, particularly in the context of this district. Again, my home, which is the gayest district in the country, the most Jewish district in the country. And I said, it's not even about the system. Don't even think about the country. It's about enlightened self-interest. If you look at what's happening in Borough Park, which is the parts of South Brooklyn that are gerrymandered to be in the district, we're seeing 30 to 40% poverty rates and a level of anti-Semitic hate crimes to the point where hate crimes have doubled last year alone, 2/3 of which were anti-Semitic. People getting beat, hit in the head with stones, synagogues being graffitied. This is just normal life. And so it's waking people up to the fact, in the context of this district, that what we saw happen in Europe, this max exodus of the Jewish population there, has, unfortunately, the Jewish community, at least in the United States, has had this peaceful and secure life now for centuries. Mm-hmm. And that's beginning to come into question. And if you look at the last time we entered a Great Depression, if you look at Germany in 1928, you see a 1-to-1 correlation between the rise in unemployment post 1928 and the Nazi seats in the Reichstag. Dictatorship was democratically elected. After hyperinflation, the devaluation of the mark.
Yeah, what caused the hyperinflation?
Well, so again, by all accounts, the collapse of the global economy. And
no, but that wasn't. I mean, if you look at the Treaty of Versailles to effectively end World War I, the Allied powers put via that treaty significant reparations that Germany owed the Allied powers. And when they quickly realized, actually the US, after the treaty was passed, the US then called essentially that debt in the 1930s, pre-World War II. And what happened is Germany couldn't pay it back. So they started printing money. And that is where you saw the massive inflation occur, to the point where the mark was basically invaluable. And that's essentially what Hitler used to rise to power for the second time. So it was really a debt question caused by the Americans.
Well, this is in part, I was excited to see you share this kind of passion and excitement around Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, founded after the financial crisis, which we still haven't recovered from, learned the lessons from, or really changed any of our.
What should we have learned from 2008?
We printed $4 trillion for the banks, and we basically held no one.
Wait, Jonathan, sorry, that's not true. Because, if you look at the federal balance sheet after 2008, basically went from 900 billion to about 2 trillion. And a lot of that money, over 3 billion lent out to the banks, was paid back in terms of 3.6 billion. The government taxpayer money actually made interest on the money from the banks, which is very different from what's happening now, by the way, which is this money is going out in the form of grants where we make nothing and our tax dollars are just flowing out to the rich. So maybe don't use 2008. Maybe use what's happening right now as a better example of what you're trying to advocate for.
Yeah, we don't even, to your point, we don't even have to look at more than a decade ago. We can look at right now, where the multi-trillion-dollar response to COVID, a tiny, tiny fraction has gone to direct cash relief and grants to people, families, and small businesses. And this is the fundamental script we have to flip, which is, if you're a small business, if you're an entrepreneur, if you have skin in the game and have built your own enterprise, you're left out to dry. But if you're a large multinational, let's say you're Amazon, you're paying essentially zero in federal taxes, then you're getting direct support. And so we have to rebalance the scales and rewrite the rules so that people who want to start businesses can.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, walk me in terms of corporations. And I mean, just read a headline actually on Twitter, like Elon Musk, because of the Tesla's performance, looking at a $700 million essentially payout from equity. I mean, talk to me about CEO pay. Do you feel like this is contributing to inequality?
Certainly, if you look at the data over the past number of decades, the returns to capital and the returns to C-suite has outpaced, and the gap has outpaced the returns to labor. There's a lot of reasons for this, but part of the whole message and the driving impetus behind the Freedom Democrats and the Yang Gang is we're trying to raise the floor, not lower the ceiling. The emphasis is on a universal basic income, an idea that was supported from the likes of Milton Friedman and has been in effect in Alaska for almost 4 decades in a deep red Republican conservative state, supported by Greg Mankiw, George Bush's chief economist, supported now by Anthony Scaramucci and even Steve Mnuchin at times. And so it is bipartisan because the kind of really conservative economic value of not having government bureaucracy decide and make choices for you, but empowering people with their own agency and liberty to live the lives they choose to lead, is both. It's simultaneously a progressive principle. This is what Martin Luther King was fighting for in his last days before he was assassinated. But also, again, what Milton Friedman argued for, and 1,000 economists argued to Congress. This actually passed the U.S. House of Representatives twice in 1971 and almost became law under Nixon.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of people, by the way, I don't think there's a lot of people listening right now that would be necessarily against UBI, but it's like, here's where I think most the Democrats, right? And I talk about the Republicans and the Democrats, and me, I never tell people what I am, because quite frankly, I'm a rational guy that can be convinced of anything. That's the real answer. I'm allowed to change my mind, and I do it all the time. But like, if I was rooting for one party, and let's say it was the Democrats, and the problem is like the mixed messaging. And what I mean by that is, I mean, let me ask you actually, you mentioned during Yang's campaign, the enemy was essentially automation. And we can argue about, was that effective or not versus an individual person driving the automation, maybe, Jeff Bezos, for example, right? But in your opinion, is automation good or bad?
The reality is technology is ambivalent. And we often see the destructive power of technology come to the fore before its creative potential. And this is true whether you're building trains and railroads or gunpowder or artificial intelligence and software. And so technology can be bad or good. There's nothing inevitable to it.
I mean, I just read a great book by Carlota Perez about technical revolutions, and basically another one by Jeff Booth, The Price of Tomorrow, that basically argues ever since 1971 in Santa Barbara, when Intel introduced their chip and Moore's Law, technology is always deflationary. It should bring prices down. And the issue we've seen over the last 50 years is you have the US government with an inflation target of 2%. So you have printing money to try and keep an inflation target while tech continues to advance and Moore's Law doubles more and more frequently, and they compete with each other. So you have this massive divergence. That divergence also correlates, ironically, to the gap between rich and poor, because when the Fed prints money, it's not evenly distributed, to your point earlier. So one of the questions I find myself asking a ton is, why are we obsessed with the unemployment numbers? Wouldn't it be a healthier view to say, what if everyone worked less to spend more time with families, to take care of themselves? Let's say they only worked 1 day a week, and we let technology decrease the price of things so you could buy the same with only one day a week sort of income. Isn't the better question to say, how do we drive unemployment up and let automation take over so we're more efficient?
So certainly the primary issue is the absence of cash. And so even before this crisis, by all accounts, nearly 50% of Americans could not afford an unexpected $500 bill. And so people have, 1, 2, 3, 4 jobs, multiple gigs, right? But they don't have enough cash. So that is exactly why proponents of technology and automation like Musk, like Sam Altman, and many techies in Silicon Valley have come on board with a universal basic income, because they see firsthand what you're describing, which is we automate millions of the manufacturing jobs, millions of the retail jobs, of call center jobs, of truck driving and transportation jobs over the coming years. That's half of all American jobs. But we shouldn't be focused on protecting jobs. We should be focused on protecting people and what people need to start their businesses, to pursue their passion, to do what they want to do. Is they need cash, they need capital.
See, I would argue what they actually need is to make a dollar go further. So even if you give everyone $2,000 a month, but you then model some form of inflation because there's more money in the system, you potentially cannot, there's not not necessarily a direct correlation. So like the question I always find myself asking, and I like putting in front of folks like you, is how do you decouple someone's job from all of their income and at the same time make sure that the Fed stops printing so much money? So for example, if they go into, inflationary periods always benefit asset holders, the person that owns your building that you pay rent to. Your rent's going to go up because they just took more debt, right? Because money was available and they have to cover that. So things like you just saw food and rent go up and other things get cheaper. So the question is, how do you do both? Like, how do you make sure prices keep coming down while also giving people a stronger base to start from?
Yes. So this is such an important question. And your take on it is very perceptive, because we use inflation as this kind of catch-all terms, but to your exact point, actually, if you look at the core drivers of inflation today, it's education, housing, and healthcare, these highly broken, highly regulated markets. And if you take education as an example, where the increase in tuition has outpaced inflation by a really shocking order of magnitude, going up, I think, 250% over the past just even 2.5 decades or so. But has the value of a college degree, has the quality of the education really gone up? That's questionable.
But Jonathan, can you blame, let's look at education for a second. Can you blame colleges for increasing their price when they know the federal government will give a lot of cheap money to students to pay the increased price? Wouldn't you increase prices if you ran a business and you knew there was free money to pay you?
Exactly. And that's why you're exactly right, Nathan. The system is working exactly as designed. There's nothing really awry, because all of the incentives are such that if you're the federal government, you give someone a $100,000 loan, no questions asked, to go to law school, right? But if someone wants to start a small business, they're going to have to do an incredible amount of hoop jumping and go through an incredible amount of red tape to get basic access to grants and startup capital. And so this is the fundamental change we have to make. And the reality is that college is not the be all end all, right? And I think you know this very well, where only 1 in 3 people even have a college degree in the United States. Mm-hmm. And of those who have a college degree, almost half are underemployed. So they're working in a job or a field that doesn't require that degree. And I think what you've shown, and many others working in technology in particular, is that these institutions, which have peddled this particular narrative that, to be saved, to have a secure, stable livelihood, you have to get a college degree. Those narratives are falling apart.
Talking about narratives that are falling apart, Democrats spend so much time focused on increasing minimum wage, which in my opinion is such a waste of energy that could be better spent on arguing for UBI. And the reason I look at this is because when you look at a company like McDonald's, right, if they realize they can replace the cashier with a robot and it's cheaper, you want to incentivize that increased efficiency, because ideally it eventually reflects itself in cheaper prices of hamburgers. What you instead have are unions and Elizabeth Warren and other Democrats arguing for higher minimum wages, which will only accelerate people looking to replace more expensive humans with robotics. Why can't and why isn't the Democratic Party united, around ignoring spending energy and time and all this on minimum wage and instead focusing on how to get a program like the Freedom Dividend in place?
So this is a great question, and it's not even conjecture. It's not even theoretical, where McDonald's formally committed and invested in the AI to essentially do just that, with drive-throughs, with automated machines to order and take orders, and not even just on the front end, on the back end, even in the food production and the burger flipping. So this really is one of the fundamental challenges. But historically, to kind of unpack why this is the case, the base of the Democratic Party was the unionized labor manufacturing base. And this was the case for nearly a half century. And to your point, I mean, there was really only one voice in the presidential race who was, perhaps even calling out the reality that, it's not about bringing the old jobs back. There's no going back. And we're seeing this now. More people are catching on. Is that the firms that are laying off and furloughing tens of thousands of workers, they're not going to rehire them, unfortunately, at the end of this crisis. And I think your question is apt, and it's the reason I'm running. It's the reason there's a wave of Yang Gang running, because again, you might think, well, reason is on our side or the facts are on our side. That is not enough.
So you do not support a $15 minimum wage, yes or no?
That is not the priority. The priority is to put cash directly into people's hands through a universal basic
income.
income.
Let's talk about that. What does that cost annually? Let's say Jonathan gets his way, it's approved tomorrow. What's it cost?
So the headline cost is much lower than one would think, but it's on the order of $2.5 trillion.
Okay, now take out you would obviously articulate that the net cost is going to be lower because you're going to pull out a lot of welfare programs and other stuff. What things do you feel UBI replaces?
So the goal is to build a floor, a foundation, right? Capitalism where income doesn't start at zero. But, and this as, someone, steeped in P&Ls and business accounting.
What gives you that impression?
We have a revenue problem as well as an expense problem in the federal government. And the key move we have to make is to pass a broad-based consumption tax, a value-added tax. And what this will let us do is if we pass a value-added tax, which almost every other industrialized economy in the world has. In Europe, the average VAT is around 20%. Mm-hmm. If we pass a value-added tax of around 10%, which is the most efficient way for us to capture the gains, especially in the realm of software and artificial intelligence, where in the United States, we love to tax labor. We love to tax human labor, but we should recalibrate and incentivize the things we want more of, which is more jobs, more human labor, more productivity, and ratchet up the value-added tax on things like artificial intelligence, like luxury consumption, and the like. So if we pass a 10% value-added tax, that on its own conservatively would bring in $800 billion annually new revenue into the system. And this continues and grows in perpetuity because again, it's like oxygen in the system, where if you think about like your phone or your computer or what have you, there's all these components in the value chain, right? The silicone, the glass, the aluminum, the plastic, what have you. And what a value-added tax enables us to do is get a tiny slice. Every single Amazon sale, every single Facebook ad, every single Google ad, Uber mile, and eventually every autonomous vehicle mile, right? Especially as more and more people get pushed to the wayside. Mm-hmm. So that's really the key component is this can most certainly be deficit neutral in large part because we're just missing on all this cash, all this capital sitting on the table because we don't have a value-added tax in place.
Pure Thai Food House on 9th and 52nd, my favorite spot. Okay, $13 for their pad Thai. If they're now, having to pay an extra 10%, don't they just increase and add that? And now that same pad Thai costs $15.
So if you look at the data on the implementation of a value-added tax, again, on average in Europe of double the level being proposed, a small fraction of the increase in the value-added tax does get transferred onto the consumer. But because it's at every single part of the value chain, right? So all the cost of goods sold, all the components in the packaging, it's a self-reinforcing tax. Because if you're the manufacturer of, let's say, I don't know, the like Thai food box, right? And there's some metal component, there's some paper component, and what have you, you have an incentive to collect and make sure that the upstream supplier has paid their 10% tax as well. So by the data, yes, a small fraction of the costs will be passed on to consumers. But the kicker is we're not just sending this revenue, this cash, to go sit in the federal government and get lost somewhere in the pipes. We're using the most direct and efficient way of direct aid to people, which is then transferring it in turn through the freedom dividend, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you spend, to your point about consumption patterns and making your dollar go further, if you spend less than $120,000 a year on stuff, then you are so much better off. And that's basically 94% of all people in the United States, because there's money coming in from oxygen in the system, from all the transactions, all the production, all the manufacturing, and then money going out directly to people. And that completes and reinvigorates the entire cycle and has this multiplying effect in the economy.
One of the things, complexity kills any good plan. So the simpler someone can make this, the more effective. And the simplest thing is there's people dying from a virus right now. Give people money as fast as possible. That's real simple, right? When that, I don't want to call it an advantage, but when that doesn't exist, part of the things with the VAT tax that people debate about is, even to your point, you just said if you give a 10% value added tax, including the restaurant, including Amazon, including a Facebook ad, national GDP in the States is 21 trillion bucks. 10% of that would be, significantly more than 800 billion in new income. It'd be more like, 2 trillion in income. So when you tell me 800 billion in revenue from the VAT tax instead of 2.2 trillion, what that tells me is you've meticulously thought through who would have to pay that tax, which companies would of the 22 trillion in GDP and which ones would not. Doesn't that add so much complexity and invite so much lobbying into the system that makes the whole plan slow down?
So what's great, so there's a couple of points on this. One is that about 2/3 of those 21 trillion is in consumer spending on the consumption side. And then the other is that this is, to your point, actually one of the simplest. It's the simplest in implementation, in administration, and even in communication. We're kind of walking through all the nuances on the back end, but very simply, as Andrew Yang had said for almost 2.5 years, the Asian man wants to give you $1,000 a month for the rest of your life. Very simple message to understand. And to your point, the reasoning behind it is also very simple. Now, people are literally dying. Then people are struggling, can't pay their bills. And so it's actually one of the simplest things to administer, because the federal government is really, really good at sending large numbers of checks to large numbers of people. And we saw this now with the $1,200 stimulus check. Granted, it's not enough. Granted, there were some and many issues in the administration and hurdles. But in large part, Nathan, it was because it was means tested, because they added all these hurdles. You have to prove you have a tax return. You have to prove you're poor enough to get it under a certain income threshold. So what happens when we means test programs is we create all sorts of incentives in the form of lobbying and in the form of just even personal mechanisms to underreport or file in a particular state or have a particular marital status or what have you. The simplest thing, the most efficient thing economically to pass is direct cash transfers directly to people.
Every American, no issues, no process to figure out poor or rich, just everyone go start tomorrow.
Exactly.
All right, you have a couple minutes to talk about data bill of rights?
We do have a couple more minutes.
Okay, I'll hit you with a quick question. I'm going to make this really simple.
Sure.
There's a lot of people arguing like Facebook has way too much power with all of its users putting so much energy into making it what it is today. How do you make it from a regulatory perspective so that every time you or I or anyone else posts a status update on Facebook, we own that status update? Or if we put out like the Google search and I'm searching for Advil in Austin, Texas, how do I make sure that I own that piece of information, not Google, and monetize it via an ad network that I get nothing of?
Yeah. So again, a great question, but also just grounded in reality, where if you look at the GDPR, the set of data rules in Europe, again, highly imperfect, many flaws, many issues in the implementation and the enforcement. But it's really as simple as we have this body called Congress with 400, plus representatives, House of Representatives from across the country, and you write it into law that data is a property right. Data is a fundamental and that these are fundamental rights of ownership. And just like every other positive right that we've enshrined into our Constitution or through any statute, it's something you write on paper. And that makes.
But what does it mean though? Like this problem is like people hear you and I think they're probably listening going, it makes sense. But then like I'm about after this interview to go write a status update on Facebook. How do you I buy this house, I get a deed. I post a Facebook status update. What does Facebook now say? Nathan, can we pay you 50 cents, before you post this update? We're paying you to own this data so we can then use it to target you with ads later. I mean, how does that actually work? Totally.
So right now, I think it's important to offer the contrast of basically how it works now, right? So Facebook is a great example, right? So you log in, we all agree with, without having read any of the click wrap agreements, we've signed and provided our consent for our data to be sold and resold. We saw this happen in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where if even a friend or a friend of a friend, they're 60 million people, and the way we interact with our data is as such. I got a push notification from Facebook saying, "Hey, we apologize. We're so sincerely sorry. You were one of the 60 million whose friends or friends of friends data may have been breached in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Sorry." And in any other context, any other sector of the economy, that just would not hold. Mm-hmm. And the reality is data is the new oil. And Yuval Harari put it best. He said, whoever controls the algorithms is the government. And so there are many ways to fundamentally rethink. So people like Tristan Harris and other design ethicists, like this goes into the fundamental architecture of the apps and how we interact with the software. So right now we just assume we're going to get a freemium service, right? We're going to get the free service, whether that be Google Maps or the search engine or Facebook or what have you, in exchange for our data. But we're not even making that choice consciously. It's just how it is. And so the point is, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way.
So put a pop-up up everywhere.
Well, I mean, so there's some alternatives around informed and active consent, making you more aware, but those don't really tend to work because again, there are these like dozens of pages of legalese and complex information that any rational consumer would accept because you want the benefits of the service.
Yeah. And a lot of companies, because of GDPR, because consumers are now expecting a GDPR pop-up, are getting consumers to accept that because they know they're going to accept it. And they're getting way more information than they would have gotten earlier. It didn't actually do what it's supposed to do.
Exactly. And so this is some of the great limitations of the use of disclosure as this regulatory kind of panacea, where sometimes actually, to your point, if I give you more and more and more information, this is the kind of Huxleyan world we live in now, where there's just constant misinformation, disinformation, information everywhere. It actually makes it easier for the firm and harder for you.
That's right.
And so having data as a privacy right, or data as a property right, rather, could mean that when you, let's say, if you choose to go onto Facebook, you can have a choice. You can basically have a dial that says, if I, let's say, pay $9.99 for the service, and they've actually run tests, and they see how much are you willing to pay in exchange for certain privacy trade-offs. And we all have our own point. I may value that at $4.99. You may value it at $13.99. The point is, you can reconfigure it so that you have a choice. And you can.
I don't ever see that actually. I just do not see that actually happen. It sounds great in practice. I don't see it happen. Here's what I'm going to end on this question. You can have a short, a long question, however you want. Jack Dorsey said many times that if he could figure out a way to decentralize Twitter, he would, to your point, right? And we're talking specifically about blockchain. What if there's 100 Twitter blocks, there's 100 Twitter coins, and they're split up into little tenths of a thing based off like who's the most prolific tweeters that get the most retweets and likes, right? Twitter did revenue of $3.46 billion over the trailing 12 months. There's tax revenue for the states. If a company and a utility, many would argue, like Twitter, is now run on blockchain, which is controlled by no government, right? But it does fit in this utopia version of we now own all our data finally. There is no Jack Dorsey, there is no Jeff Bezos, there is no central figure getting wealthy. How do you make money as a government? How do you pay? Where's the tax?
Yes. So there's so much here. And I think this is really exciting because this is the vanguard. This is the bleeding edge. And we just saw the recent halving day, right? Where the block wasn't, was mined in China, not in the United States. And so we have to bring Bitcoin and blockchain innovation back to New York and back to the United States in particular, because it's been regulated away. And so I think Wyoming in particular has a model of legislation around Bitcoin and blockchain to enable innovation to happen, to actually happen and develop.
But that's electrical subsidies. The reason China and Iceland do so much mining is because they give electrical subsidies to miners. That's why you've had the centralization. The US, I do not think, will ever give electrical subsidies to miners setting up shops in Wyoming.
I completely hear you. Nothing is easy. No fight will ever be. We said we'd never reach the moon. We said we would never have Social Security. We said we would never have Medicare. There's a lot of things that seemed impossible. And to your point and to the whole thrust of this conversation, and really to what Friedman said in 1962, the politically impossible only becomes the inevitable in times of crisis. And it's incumbent upon all of us to push and bring those ideas to the fore so that in those moments, those ideas can come to the table and become reality.
Jonathan Herzog turning 25 here in a couple of days. He needs 30,000 votes on November 3rd to displace Jerry Nadler in the New York Congressional District number 10. Jonathan, good luck, man. Go get those votes.
Thank you so much. And please do chip in what you can at herzog2020.com.
Spell it.
I can tell you, HERZOG2020.com. We take cash and crypto contributions on our website. I can tell you exactly $18 puts our ads in front of 1,943 registered Democrats in the district. And if you scale that up, if you max out and pitch in $2,800, you can get our ad, our name, our vision, this shared vision for our country in front of every single registered Democrat in the district to make this happen.
Herzog 2020, guys. Check it out. Thanks, Jonathan.
Appreciate it.
All right, guys, what do you think? Can Jonathan Herzog get it done on June 23rd with 30,000 votes? We will see. If you have questions about his freedom dividend, his data bill of rights, or his thoughts on blockchain in the future, be sure to leave a comment below. Also, if you enjoyed the interview, make sure you click the thumbs up below and click subscribe so you don't miss any future interviews I do. After you click subscribe, make sure you click the bell button so you get those notifications. We have interviews coming up every weekend, every weekday. We've got an interview coming out with a new founder every day at 2 p.m. Eastern. We go live every Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. And we do great long-form interviews like this, which we release about once or twice a week. I don't want you to miss any of them. Thanks so much, guys, for your support. I'll be in the comments below if you have any questions.